Hi, this is voice of the St. Joseph Sports Network, Matt Martucci, and you're listening to Sports and Rants on Radio 1851.
And we are live with Pirates President Frank Coonelly. How are you doing today, Frank?
Terrific. How are you?
Oh, we're doing great. Thanks for joining us. It's a shame about Bucktober. I was looking forward to seeing the Pirates in a World Series this year.
As were we, yes. Bucktober didn't last very long in Pittsburgh, unfortunately, as I think we really learned the lesson of the wild card game is you want to avoid it at all costs if you can. And the only people that like the wild card game are the ones that eventually end up in it, because you really try to win your division, and the wild card game is a consolation prize. But our experience now is 2 years in a row with the wild card game, and I have to say we loved it when we were in it last year and won and moved on to the division series, and we're not so enamored with it this year when we went in and had one of our poorer games of the year, faced a very tough pitcher, which you can do in baseball, and didn't produce anything offensively, and then also gave up 8 runs. You see those games along a 162-game baseball season, and they are aberrations from your normal season, and that game was an aberration for us because we lost our fair share of close games this year. We got boat raced very few times, but we got boat raced in that game, and so we're I guess now we're down to 26 other or 25 other clubs. We're working on the 2015 season and trying to put ourselves in a position to have a much longer Bucktober in 2015.
Now, in the front office, are you now seeing this as a regular thing with the Pirates after years of struggling? It seems like the Pirates are now this playoff team.
Well, that's our expectation for ourselves, for sure. And we said this from the time we got here, is that we were not looking to build a team that could get lucky and win one year. We were looking to build a sustainable championship caliber organization. Not easy to do, but we see some teams this year who certainly have done that. And the St. Louis Cardinals are in our division, and not only do they have the second most World Series championships historically behind the Yankees, but over this last stretch, this is their 4th year in a row in the National League Championship Series. They've done a great job of building a sustainable winner. The Giants seem to be every other year, but also have an opportunity to win their 3rd World Series in 5 years, which would be a tremendous accomplishment. So both of those organizations have really built something that's sustainable, and that's what we're looking to do. Interestingly, in the American League, you have 2 teams that obviously have not been there in quite a while, but also 2 teams that are in markets that are not among the largest markets in the game. So another good illustration for us that it's not always about how big your market is, and it's not always about how much you spend in payroll, but it is about how you go about building a team that can be championship caliber. And for teams in markets like Kansas City and Pittsburgh, that is really from building within. And the Royals have struggled for many years under their general manager, Dayton Moore, trying to build this thing, and it's great to see them make it this year.
Now, what's your philosophy on that whole idea of money ball and small market teams building up to be playoff contenders?
The philosophy is that we can do it, point one, and I love all of these examples of other teams, whether it's the Pirates making the playoffs in each of the last 2 years, or now the Royals and the Orioles making it all the way into the championship series. The A's doing it for many years consecutively. Obviously, they have not advanced beyond the first round, unfortunately for them, in a while. But so one, it can be done in a market like ours. Secondly, it's not necessarily a money ball or non-money ball. Money ball was mainly a moniker for a statistically based as opposed to a subjectively scout-based analysis. Great book, good movie, great book, interesting story. Probably never really as extreme a story as Hollywood portrays it, but that's typically the case with Hollywood. But it's really the foundation of your building has to be from within. The foundation of how you can retain and maintain a competitive balance or competitive advantage over your competitors has to start from the way that you scout, acquire, and then develop players throughout your own system. It has to be the core of any, in my judgment, of any building of a team in a market like ours. And I go further and argue that even if you were running a team in a larger market, your core better be being outstanding at scouting, acquiring, and developing players throughout your own system. And I would point to the St. Louis Cardinals now as part of this terrific run that they're on. While they're in a market that's not one of the larger markets, they drew almost 4 million fans this year. They had the second highest attendance in all of Major League Baseball. That's history, that's tradition, terrific ballpark, winning team, all those played a factor in it. And certainly that attendance helps them spend more, and they did spend much more than a Kansas City or a Pittsburgh in payroll. But of all the teams that are remaining of all the teams that qualified for the playoffs, the St. Louis Cardinals had the largest percentage of their 25-man roster come up through their minor league system, were drafted and were signed originally by St. Louis and came up through their minor league system. And to me, that's the core fundamental basis for building championship teams, doing that better than others. And the Cardinals, while it's tough for me to say it, being a competitor in their division, right now they're doing it as well or better than anybody.
Yeah, you spoke about this bringing up guys from the minors. How does the Pirates system go about that, scouting players, and how do you know they're going to succeed at that major league level?
Well, you don't. You don't know. There's no guarantees. We're in an industry in which your major inputs are human beings, and there's no guarantee that somebody that you select as a 17-year-old in a U.S. draft or that you sign as a 16-year-old in the Dominican Republic will, with all the training that you give him, will turn out to be an all-star player. But so there's no way you can know that, but you have to have outstanding scouts who know what to look for, who are implementing an organizational philosophy of what we like, what we think plays ultimately at the major leagues, what the projection is for these young players. And then I firmly believe that has to be done in a very skillful manner, but then once you get these players, we need to develop them to their maximum potential and not allow any of them to waste the skill and talent that they have and that we identified in them when we were scouting them and drafting them and signing them originally, and make sure that we put our players in a position to learn the game the way that we want them to learn the game, play Pirate baseball from the time that they're 17 or 18 years old, and ultimately, if you do all those things right, you're going to get a larger percentage of those players coming up and having a meaningful impact in Pittsburgh than your competitors will. But you're never going to be 100% or any number close to it. But this is a game of numbers, a game of attrition, and if more of your guys, because you're scouting better, because you're developing them better, because you're maximizing their potential, if more of your guys are getting to the major leagues and having an impact than your competitors, then you're going to be winning at the major league level.
Now, we talked about the market share, and to go more in depth into that, with TV radio revenue, what are some disadvantages with revenue inequity in certain markets?
I don't look at them as revenue disadvantages. I look at it as not every team has access to the same potential revenue in each of the major categories of revenue, and as a result, you need to figure out when you're in a market like Pittsburgh, which is never going to have the TV revenue as a market like Los Angeles or New York or Boston or even Philadelphia. you need to figure out how to, one, maximize other revenue streams that are not as highly dependent on the number of people that live within your demographic region, which is the driving factor for local TV revenue. Point one. Point two, you have to learn how to do more with less payroll. But then there's also the disparities are not as great as they once were or otherwise could be based on the different demographics of each market, because Major League Baseball does have a meaningful, can be even more meaningful, but we do have a meaningful local revenue sharing program in which a portion of the revenues, all local revenue, which obviously TV is for many the most significant piece of local revenue, a portion of every club's local revenue is shared with the teams that are in markets like Pittsburgh. So a piece of, for instance, the Los Angeles Dodgers TV contract is shared with other teams that are in markets like Pittsburgh and Kansas City and Cincinnati. So the disparity is not as great as it would be, but for the local revenue sharing program, it still exists, but we need to figure out how to maximize the gate receipt revenue that we have access to here in Pittsburgh, which is not as dependent on the number of eyeballs in your demographic region.
Now, how does all this revenue play a factor into keeping like a fan favorite like Russell Martin and keeping him in Pittsburgh, a veteran like him?
Well, that's a great question for our current off season. On our last regular season home game, I stood at our gates and shook hands with as many of our fans and thanked them for supporting us this year as we set an all-time attendance record for the Pittsburgh Pirates this year. And I would say I may have shook hands with maybe 10,000 of the 40,000 that were here at the stadium, and probably about 90% of them told me that we had to sign Russ Martin. So I should have been wearing a sign, "We get it, we need to sign Russ." So, one of my jobs is to maximize our revenue generation potential, and the principal reason for that is to be able to provide our general manager with the resources necessary to build a championship team. And that includes trying to, giving him enough resources that make it possible for him to retain some of our free agent players who we want to retain. We're never going to be in a position where we can retain all of the players who come up through our system or we acquire, as we did with Martin, as a free agent, because even the teams that have $220 million payrolls, which is not something that we could afford, can retain every player. And there are 29 other teams out there. I'd say in this particular off-season, there may be as many as 8 that have a need for a catcher. So it's not as if, as long as we offer X, Russ is going to be back here, because there are at least 8 to 10 other teams that I'm sure are going to be interested in Russ, and he's going to make a decision based on a number of factors. So my job is to provide our general manager with the resources that put him in a position to be able to retain these players, but there are decisions that have to be made in terms of allocation of money, and if another team among the 29 that we compete with decides that they're going to provide Russ Martin with a contract of a dollar value and or length that doesn't make any sense for us, then Russ will sign somewhere else and we'll need to replace him.
So now we're going to get into a little bit of how you got to position. You, like myself, are a graduate of William Tennent High School from Southampton, Warminster area. How did you go from there to now being the president of the Pirates?
Well, my journey was not initially intentional to get into baseball, though growing up originally in the northeast section of Philadelphia and then ultimately in Warminster and and going to William Tennent and loving my high school career there. My number one love as a kid growing up was baseball. I ended up not being a particularly good baseball player once I hit high school and kind of topped out in 10th grade baseball playing for the 10th grade team because I wasn't good enough to make the junior varsity. But I loved baseball. It was my first passion. I ended up being a better ice hockey player, but loved baseball. But did not go to school thinking that I wanted to have a career in baseball. Instead, went to Penn State and ultimately decided that I wanted to go to law school. Went to Catholic University Law School in Washington, D.C. In part, went to D.C. because I thought I wanted to get into politics. I quickly realized, spending limited time in D.C., that I wanted nothing to do with politics, and decided that I fell in love with labor law, and I got a job with what was then, and I think now, the best labor law firm in Washington, D.C., which is Morgan, Lewis & Bockius. Actually started in Philadelphia. And at the time, Morgan Lewis didn't represent Major League Baseball, so I didn't go there hoping that I would get to work on some baseball matters, because at the time they didn't work on baseball. But shortly after I got there, unrelated to me being there, of course, because I was just a young associate, Major League Baseball came to Morgan Lewis and one of our senior partners, and we began to represent baseball as their chief outside labor counsel, which was fortuitous for me. Even more fortuitous for me was that I was asked by this senior partner to be one of the lawyers on the account. Got an opportunity to work on the account, and from there I worked on the account for many years, was involved in collective bargaining negotiations, strikes, lockouts, large litigation, large arbitrations, salary arbitrations, dealing with individual players, and ultimately was asked by Commissioner Seelig to join Major League Baseball as the General Counsel of Labor Relations, which I did in 1998, and did that for 10 years until Bob Nutting, the owner of the Pittsburgh Pirates, asked me if I would join the Pirates, and at that time it was the right time for me to move from the commissioner's office to an individual club, and to try to be a part of a team that was able to bring back baseball to one of the original National League teams that has a great baseball tradition here in Pittsburgh.
All right, as we're wrapping up the interview with you, Frank, just two more questions. How important is it in Pittsburgh with the community relations, especially charity and the RBI program?
Well, it's part of our DNA, and that is to give back to the community, and it's a responsibility and obligation that we take very seriously. We are very fortunate as a Major League Baseball team to have many fans who love this sport and support us financially and emotionally, and we believe strongly that it's our obligation to give back. So Pirates Charities is a very important part of who the Pittsburgh Pirates are, and our work in the community, building fields, building fields for special needs children, helping groups that are addressing and attacking the cancer issue, are all very, very important pieces of what the Pittsburgh Pirates are all about, and the RBI program is something that we've supported for a long time and continue to support, but we're really trying to support all of baseball and youth participation in baseball in our region and in the areas in which we do business.
All right, final question. If you were ever offered the commissioner's position, would you take it, and what would you do differently?
Well, ever is a large word, but I will not have to consider that for quite a while, because my good friend who I worked with at Morgan Lewis and Bockius, and he and I went to the commissioner's office at the same time, is Rob Manford, who was just elected the 10th commissioner of baseball. And Rob's a young man, so I expect that he'll be in that position for a long time. So I don't think that I'll have that opportunity. Would be a terrific responsibility to be the commissioner of baseball. Right now, I said this before Rob was elected, I am very happy to be with a club as opposed to in the commissioner's office, and there are still a lot of things to do here in Pittsburgh. We haven't accomplished any of our real goals and objectives yet, and I'm, as I'll go home tonight and I'll watch the start of the American League Championship Series, and then tomorrow the National League Championship Series, and it will make me redouble our efforts to get there next year, because that's what I think this city deserves. So I have a lot of things to do before I ever consider the commissioner's office, and they've got a great guy who's just going to start out. In terms of what the issues are facing him and us as an industry, there are many. I'll just throw a couple out there now. One, I mentioned how important it is to Pirates Charities to give kids the opportunity to play baseball. So youth participation in baseball is something that I think we need to address as an industry and individual clubs. It's been declining. It's really important for the growth of our game that kids participate, and I also think it's an important part of growing up in America. Quite frankly, as I mentioned, I loved baseball when I grew up, and I think it's a great thing for kids to do as they're growing up. So I think building programs that will grow youth participation in baseball should be one of the top priorities on Mr. Manford's agenda.
Now, any final things you would like to say to the Pirates fans out there?
I hope there are many of them, and I'm looking forward to. I will just leave them with what I said just a couple of minutes ago, and that is that while we're glad to be considered a playoff contender again, we didn't get into this to be playoff contenders. We got into this to build a championship team, and we are working hard. In fact, I'm leaving first thing tomorrow morning to go to Bradenton, where we have our spring training home and where our baseball team has been holed up for the last week, building our strategic plan for next year. So we're already hard at work in trying to put together the pieces that will push this rock all the way up the hill and bring the 6th World Championship back to Pittsburgh.
All right, Frank, thanks for joining us today. And
Brett, my pleasure.
And we'll be right back after this break.
This concludes our podcast of Sports and Rants with Brent and Pan. Thank you for listening. Please follow us on Twitter at Sports and Rants. Like us on Facebook. Remember to subscribe to us on iTunes. And visit our website, www.sportsandrantz.blogspot.com. It would help our rankings on iTunes if you rate and review our podcast. Thanks, and have a good day.